All right, so you've been introduced to some of the main characters of the book itself. You've been introduced to Nick, who's the narrator, Tom and Daisy, who are married to each other, and Jordan Baker. You've also heard about Gatsby, but haven't actually seen him. Gatsby lives in this kind of area of rumor for the first part of the book, where you don't actually see him, but you hear a lot about him, which means that by the time you do actually meet Gatsby as a character, you have a lot of expectation about who he is and what he does based on what other people have said, but you haven't actually met him yourself. So keep an eye on Gatsby and what people say about him as opposed to what you actually experience for yourself when you meet him. I have uploaded onto the class website a page of annotations that I made from my copy of The Great Gatsby as I started reading it. So you do have an example of the notes that I take while I read. Some of the things that you may have noticed is that I write down when I'm introduced to main characters. I write that down in the side margins because it makes it easier when I'm going back to get ready for a test or an essay to have that information in a way that's handy. I also underline phrases that I think are important. I ask questions, and you'll see a lot of that as you look through those pages. So if you have any questions, let me know. One page that I did want to point out to you that I don't think I scanned in for you is at the very end of the lunch that Nick is having with Daisy and Tom, particularly the conversation that Daisy has with Nick when Tom is not in the room. She talks a lot about the birth of her child. You don't actually see the little girl, but you hear about her. And how Daisy talks about this, I think, is particularly enlightening to her character. When Nick first introduces her, he says that she has the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who cared for her found difficult to forget. So there's a part of Daisy that's just really kind of enthralling, that's very interesting. But when you read a little bit later, there's a description that he gives where she says, where Nick says, "For a moment the last sunshine fell with a romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward breathlessly as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk." So in that particular section, he talks about how her speech is really exciting and she's really interesting to listen to, and it's kind of hard to turn away from her. But at the same time, there seems to be this kind of dark sadness about her that you can't really pinpoint and don't really know where it came from. I think in that way, Daisy kind of represents the era of the 1920s itself. It's bright and exciting, but it's also really kind of sad because, as we know, we're heading into a couple decades of really kind of rotten, hard work with the Depression and with the 1940s and the war. So anyway, the section that I really wanted to point out to you in my book is on page 17, if you have the same copy as me. She talks about how she really hopes that her daughter would be born a fool, which I find really kind of depressing from my 20th century, early 21st century woman perspective, that anyone would want their daughter to be born a fool. But I feel like in some ways Daisy thinks it's best for her to be a fool as well. And she seems to be very content to put on this very obvious mask of pretending like everything's okay and being very elaborate and giddy and girly. But it from the very beginning, at least to me, felt very fake. She goes on to say, "You see, I think everything's terrible anyhow. Everybody thinks so, the most advanced people, and I know." She just seems to be very insistent that the best way for her to live is to be foolish and stupid and sophisticated, as she puts it later. So keep an eye on Daisy. She's a pretty fascinatingly frustrating kind of character as she flits in and out of this social world and appears to have everything put together, but really just is completely falling apart. And I think that really from the very beginning you can see that Daisy is a mess. She's a disaster, really. So that's chapter 1, and I will see you in chapter 2.